And it says, "Who do people say I am?" And they answered, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah." Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man, which is that nomenclature, Son of Man, comes from the book of Daniel, must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, Jesus rebuked Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any of you want to become my followers, deny yourselves, take up your cross, and follow me. For those who would save their lives will lose it, and those who will preserve their lives for my sake and the gospel will find it." Then what does Peter do? He says, "Lord, no, can't do that. You can't suffer, you can't die." Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." So all of a sudden at once, we have Peter way up top. He's holding the keys to the kingdom. The gates of hell aren't going to prevail against him. Now all of a sudden, he's Satan. "Get behind me, Satan." One eye, one love. The word of the Lord. That was some paraphrasing, by the way. Easter morning dawned with glorious sunshine exactly 40 years ago at my home church in Southern California. I was the youth director, and I had built up a youth program over the last couple of years, which wasn't hard to do when you're only starting with 2 or 3 kids, right? I mean, anything from there is almost 100%. But 2 years prior to that, about 80 people and their children left the church. There was a split over theological differences, and the youth group had been gutted like the insides of a fish going to market. Granted, there were still about 1,000 active members remaining on that contentious Sunday day following worship. The pastor was a Reformed faith Scotsman. He had a bit of a high-pitched voice, had a lovely little accent, and there were a bunch of people who basically said, "We'd like to see you gone." So what does the pastor do? Well, he calls a meeting. And he said, "Who wants to see me go?" And of course, I'm paraphrasing again. And 80 people stand up, basically say, "We'd like to see you go." And they sat down, and guess what? 1,000 people stood up and said, "We'd like to see you stay." And the pastor says, and I kid you not, I'm sitting at the back of the church, and the pastor looks at the 80 people, and he said, "You are welcome to leave this church today, go find another church, and not come back here." Wow. So they did. The junior high and high schoolers who had been so up fell hard as their parents separated from the fellowship. Thus, 2 or 3 remaining kids. 2 months later, with minimal training, the pastor and the trustees asked if I would step in. In hindsight, I realized how desperate they must have been. Over 2.5 years later, the youth program had grown to somewhere between 150 and 200 kids in the South Pasadena area. They and their friends, some would float in and out. We would have a youth center every single day during the summertime. It would go from about 9 o'clock in the morning till about 10 o'clock at night. No matter, I was on top of my game, or so I thought, filled with boastful pride, and standing on this immense grass lawn that formed the courtyard in the middle of this church campus. From this portable pulpit on Easter morning, facing 200 people who had gathered for a glorious Easter morning sunrise service, there I was. I was so ready to preach, I can't even tell you. I had convinced the pastor I was ready to go. It was my big moment. It was all about me. No prayer between me and God beforehand. No prayer between myself and my youth leadership council. There were 5 interns at that point. The pages of the sermon weren't numbered. And I had invited God into the words that I was about to speak. So there I stood. Again, in hindsight, the moment wasn't about me so much as what I expected it to be, which was me. That is, until a gust of wind, as I'm standing there, I am so ready. And this gust of wind comes up, and it blows my sermon pages into the audience all over the lawn, 10 ways of Sunday. And I will tell you that the next 10 or 15 minutes were not pretty. I was dying up there. This was my home church. These were people I had grown up with. This was a church right across the street from where Liz Strong lived. It was not pretty. It was a bad moment, and I was just dying. Life went on, but I learned a critical lesson called humility that day. See, but prior to that, I didn't have that kind of humbleness that Christ displays, the kind that I should have had. Remember Philippians? Jesus humbled himself and became a servant. I hadn't humbled myself, but I was definitely on the go. Perhaps many of us have been there. You know, we go so high up, we're right on a high, only to fall hard and feel the shame of the hard fall when we fall. My home church pastor put the icing on the cake the week after that morning when he called me into his office, and he stared straight at me, and I didn't know what was coming. I thought I was history. He looked at me and said, "Not really prepared, were ye?" That incredible, insidious Scottish accent. My highest moment had become at once my lowest moment, and so it was for Peter as Jesus rebuked his disciple. Peter was once on an ultra-high point, as high can get, and in the other he was as low as a snake's belly. The Gospel of Mark portrays this moment, this particular moment of Jesus and Peter with really intimate, emotional words. You feel like you are right there, experiencing the rebuke of Jesus by Peter, "Lord, you're not going to suffer," and the stunning rebuke of Peter by Jesus. Which is what about 4 weeks ago I called my message Interrupting the Son of God. Today I'm calling it Rebuking the Son of God. In one moment, Peter has identified Jesus as the living Messiah. You are the Christ. You are the Son of God. You are the Messiah. You are the one who has come to save us. And in the next moment, "Get behind me, Satan." Wow. This is powerful because after Jesus talks about his suffering and dying, the Greek language here in the New Testament, which you don't see, takes a bit of a turn. At one moment, Peter is the rock, the foundation, the Petrus. On this rock I will build my church. And in the next moment, the rock means stumbling block. You are the stumbling block. Get behind me, Satan. You are the one who stumbles. That will be people stumbling over. If only Peter had kept his mouth shut, but he didn't. He was on a high and he was on a roll. He had been exalted in front of the other disciples. Now he wanted to make sure that his teacher had gotten it wrong. "No, Master, take it back. We're on our way to Jerusalem. This is our moment. This is our moment in time. This is your moment." Forget this stuff about suffering. Poor Peter. Jesus turns and he looks at his disciples and he rebukes Peter. Caesar Caesarea Philippi is where Jesus is saying this. Caesarea Philippi, on this little map that I was trying to create for you, it is north of the Sea of Galilee, and it is where the temple of Pan was. And Pan was the god of, well, Pan we know is multiple gods. That's where pantheism comes from. And Jesus is in this Caesarea Philippi, and this is where this thing occurs. Jesus is using the same language with Peter, get behind me, Satan, that he uses with the devil in the wilderness. The Greek language is identical. Get behind me, Satan. And he's talking to the devil in the wilderness. Get behind me, Satan. Then to Peter, Jesus says, Peter, you just don't get it. You haven't learned. You're setting your mind on human things. So high up, and then to fall, and to fall hard, and to feel the shame of that hard fall. Boy, is that ever us in a nutshell. Why is this so powerful? Because it's a huge learning lesson in humility, written, Gospel of Mark, written on the heels of Jesus' brutal death and glorious resurrection. It is one of the oldest teachings in the Gospels. For years, people thought that John was the oldest piece that they had found, the oldest fragments that have been found. 2nd century AD, kind of new to 2nd century AD, close to the first. But in late 2012, a bombshell hit the world of biblical archaeology. And it was in the midst of a debate. A biblical scholar revealed that a sizable fragment of the Gospel of Mark had just been found. By and large, the public only became aware of this about 3 years ago. The biblical magazines, the Smithsonian Institute, prominent universities, all wanted a piece of this or a part of this or some knowledge of it. Some argue it is perhaps part of the original writing of the book of Mark. Most disagree. I would probably be in that same camp. So what prominent place was this fragment found? Fairly sizable one. Was it found in the Dead Sea Scroll caves? Was it found in Jerusalem, in the sacred archives? Nope. It was found on the death mask of the face of an Egyptian mummy. Okay? You say, no way. What do the kids say today? Yes way? So let me tell you how that happens. Here's how it works. In the 1st century AD Egypt, the uber-rich would still have liquid gold molded over their face when they died. They were rich enough to afford that. And then you get those Egyptian death masks. But then there were the other Egyptians who weren't quite so rich, like the royalty. They're just kind of a class line down. And as the gold would harden on the face of the royalty, well, so too did this other thing that they covered the face with to make a death mask. And in this fascinating process, linen or papyrus would be softened and shaped over the person's face. Because linen and papyrus was so extraordinarily expensive, used linen and used papyrus were used and traded. The Egyptians bought a lot of this papyrus and sent it south into Egypt. As historians and archaeologists have discovered, by removing the hardened glue fastening the material to the mummy face, they are able to pull it away, even though it pretty well destroys the mummy, and see the writing on the back side of the material's surface. They have discovered business letters, poems, Greek copies of the poet Homer, fragments from the Gospel of Thomas, shipping inventories, mundane things, and then, several years ago, a substantive piece of the Gospel of Mark. Did one is mummy? Can't say that. This fragment of Mark lifted from this mummy's face is currently being studied in the laboratories of Nova Scotia, of all places. Carbon-14 dating and new state-of-the-art technology places this large fragment within 50 or 60 years following the death of the Son of God. That is extraordinary. But here's the most exciting part about all of this. It's not that we need to learn the lesson of humility, which we do. It's not that we go high and fall hard. It's not that we find these fragments and these pieces of the gospel that make it so real to us, that make things so clear to us, that make intimate conversations come alive so quickly after the death and the resurrection of Christ. What we have here is that Mark's gospel confirms the message which became part of the work of the evangelists in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, and in particular, the theology of the great apostle Paul, as thousands converted to this Messiah that they called Christus. And what is that powerful message that was so secretive in the Gospel of Mark, and so contentious and so life-changing? It's hidden in plain sight. Mark 8, verse 31. Then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected and be killed. And Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. Verse 34, Jesus said, "If any want to follow me, let them deny themselves and take up their cross. For those who want to save their life will lose it. Those who want to save their lives for the sake of the gospel and me will find it." This isn't what the disciples signed up for. This isn't what Peter signed up for. You see, they wanted to skip the cross and grab the crown. That was the important thing. This isn't what we signed up for. We didn't sign up to suffer. That's not what Christianity is all about in the 21st century, right? Easter is about chocolate bunnies and rabbits and dressing up in big meals and hot cross buns, and if you're lucky enough, then you got the mimosas on the buffet tables. Spring has sprung, right? Yes, for us. And that is part of our truth in this century. But it wasn't how the first 200 years of Christian converts heard it. It wasn't their truth. You see, by about 200 AD, almost 1 million people had converted to Christianity. They converted on the basis of a Messiah who had suffered, crucified, tortured, dead, buried, and rose again. God in the flesh who gave himself for our sin. And for the Apostle Paul, whose theology permeated the ancient world, suffering was part and parcel of being a Christian. Paul is steeped in Isaiah's prophetic word that the Messiah would be a suffering servant. For Paul and the evangelists, you could not be a Christian and not suffer. They were one in the same. To believe otherwise was contrary to what Christ taught. And that teaching is what allowed for so many Christians, so many martyrs, to go to their deaths under the Roman Empire and across the centuries up through the Reformation and beyond today. It is what caused so many people to be lit up like torches to light up Nero's garden parties at night in his palace area. It is what caused so many people to go into the lion's den in the Lord's Colosseum. This was not for most Christians a bad thing. This was a good thing. They were being martyred. They were going to go to heaven. They were going to go because Christ had saved them, and they were saved through what? Suffering. But there was a sea change in the 20th century in Christianity. people began to reject the teaching of suffering in favor of a whole new view and interpretation of the Christian faith. No longer suffering, but abundance. Positive thinking, praise without ceasing and without suffering. Suffering had its place, but it was time for liberation. It was time for love and good things for good people. It was time for somebody like myself to get up and show just how incredible I was at preaching at that Easter sunrise service where I totally blew it. Isaiah 53, he was despised and rejected, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity. He has borne our infirmities and carried our diseases, struck down, wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. This is the suffering servant motif, which Jesus knew he was to fulfill. This is the suffering servant motif that converted almost 1 million people in the first 200 years of the Christian message. See, initially, Peter speaks for us when he rebukes Jesus. Lord, you're not going to suffer. You don't really mean that. I mean, maybe you might suffer a little bit, but this is our time. I'd rather not go there. I'd rather not suffer. Rising high, falling hard, being humble, preferably not. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, for you're focusing on human things. You're not dealing with things that are divine. So friends, our challenge this Lenten season is not to rebuke or turn away from the Son of God for telling us about his sacrifice. It's not about blowing off Jesus because he sacrificed, and we hear about that all the time. Our challenge is to continue the journey, knowing the despair of the cross that is still ahead of every one of us, but also knowing God had the last word. And this is where Christianity, I think, finds its crossroads. It is, in fact, this last word of love and of grace. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. See, for me, that's our ultimate hope. That's what our hope is in when we suffer and we die. It's that God loved us so much that he gave us his Son. Amen.
Our hymn in response to the word is number 829. We will sing verses 1 through 3 of My Faith Looks Up to Thee, followed by our affirmation.